Jonathan Labonte. I'm the Transportation Director for the City of Auburn, and I'm also President of the Lewiston and Auburn Railroad Company.
I'm Dick Woodbury, and I am on the board of the Casco Bay Trail Alliance.
Angela King, I'm the Advocacy Manager for the Bicycle Coalition of Maine.
Tony Donovan, Maine Rail Transit Coalition, a resident of Portland.
Hope Cahan, Vice Chair of the Falmouth Town Council, Chair of PAX, and Chair of Metro.
Jason Burkle, GW, St. Lawrence Atlantic.
Nate Wilds, live and work in Maine, the organization, also statement.
And I'm Phil Goff with BHB.
Tim Bryant with BHB.
Chris Chop with Greater Portland Council of Governments.
Chris, thanks for being here. We missed you last time.
Yeah, I missed you all.
Bill Shane, the town manager here in Cumberland.
Natalie Thompson, Town Planner in New Gloucester.
Scott Laflamme, Economic Development Director in Yarmouth.
Diane Barnes, Town Manager of North Yarmouth.
Nate Howard, I'm the Rail Director with Maine DOT.
And Nate Moulton will be here shortly.
Shortly,
We expect, okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks for indulging me once again on introductions. It'll probably be about 4 more times before you all look familiar again. The once a month thing doesn't help me, but.
Have to go back to Zoom.
Yeah, we'll have to get name tags next time so I can remember everybody. But we have a work session planned today. Nate, thanks for pulling this together. I think this is important, and thanks for all the answers you sent out. And maybe we can review some of that if people have. Oh, you know what? I forgot we're recording this. Sorry, my bad. We do have microphones because we are recording the meeting. The audio will definitely be helpful, so please talk into a mic. Everybody will hear you more clearly, but people at home that are live streaming in will also be able to hear us. So one of the things we talked about at the last meeting was basically timers, and I have my massive timer up at the podium. Richard?
I noticed that Brian's here. If he wants to bring up the chair, he's actually on.
Brian, pull up.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
I'll
put you
move
on the
over.
spot,
You
Brian.
can sit between Chris and I here, so you will be
Apologize for
holding the
being
mic.
late.
No worries. Brian, who are you and who do you represent?
I'm Brian Harris. I'm with Maine Yacht Center, Portland, Maine, and we're at the end of the line. Or the beginning, I guess, depending on where you're coming from.
You are our host when we all loaded up to get out, so
Just
awesome.
correction, please. The end of the line is the Portland Ocean Terminal in Portland, mile 0.0.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So I just want to ask everybody, if everybody's comfortable with 2 minutes, I want everybody to have a chance to talk today. So I did put this up just to look at the timer if you're getting close to the end of your segment. And I don't care if you speak again, but let others speak too. So we don't want to monopolize the conversation. Everybody has a lot to bring to the table, and that's why you're selected to this. So if people are comfortable with 2 or think that's 3 should be better, I don't know. 2 minutes is a lot of time to talk. So I'm going to leave it at that. And if it seems to be too short, we can adjust it accordingly as well. So I see a lot of nods, so I'm going to take that as consensus for now. Okay. All right. So the work session today, 2 items we have initially are, where are you right now and what additional information would be helpful? And then initial thoughts on majority and minority recommendations. I don't know if all of us are there yet, but I think some of us are. And I know we have shared information back through Nate. And Nate, before we jump into, I'll say we'll take item A, where are you right now and what additional information would be helpful? Do you want to just give us a brief overview of some of the stuff that you've been working on since the last meeting? Because I know you and Nate have been working on a lot of answers to people, and I think that's important too.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so, I sent out a couple question and answers that actually Nate Moulton responded to these, so if you want to go over some of those, we can later. So background questions on sort of the rail system and the trail system that he put together and some of the ongoing studies. Also, we'll talk about it later, but we're working on the formal public meeting, or the public meeting for this effort. That'll be in December, so we can talk about that later. And also, the last thing is the actual report. You've seen the economic analysis, the actual report. We're drafting up that now, and that's due to be available by the end of the month, so we'll have that prior to the public meeting for release. Again, that's a lot of background information, have a lot of information on costs for the various alternatives, and again, VHB is helping us out with that.
So Jeremiah and Jonathan, it's great that you're sitting together because I have your questions here and your answers here. I'm wondering if you wanted to share them as part of the conversation today, or did you want one of the Nates to review them in more detail at the end? It's really your call, because I think some of those should be shared into the record, and if those answers aren't complete for you, then let's talk about it or get more information for you.
Sure, I'm happy to chime in. I don't need to go through all of everything in detail. I think my questions sort of fell into a couple of buckets as I see it. One was the challenge of undertaking this process, understanding that there are other processes taking place on other rail lines, other feasibility studies, other areas of potential, and trying to understand what those may mean, trying to understand what the acquisition of the Pan Am facilities by CSX means while we're having this conversation. You can't view this facility in a vacuum without taking into account the context for everything else taking place. Based on the answers I got back, I think there's still a lot of open questions on that. So that's something that's important for me to take into account while I'm thinking through some of these questions. The other is questions around equity. I have concerns that there may be limits to outreach and awareness to certain populations, demographics, groups on this process and possible outcomes. I don't offer solutions off the top of my head for what those may be, but I do wish to register those as part of any public process. It is a challenge. As someone who's been involved with the public process, I understand it's a challenge, but
Okay.
I felt it was important to state that.
Yep. And Jonathan, what about you? Is that something you'd like to review with the committee, the answers that were provided by DOT to you? Or are you satisfied with those responses, or do you need some additional follow-up?
Yes?
Yes, yes and yes, okay.
No, I certainly recognize this is a new process. In the ideal case, the individual rail use advisory councils would influence the scope of work. I think that the statute we're operating under was driven by trail advocates, which I understand. But some of the corridors, like the Mountain Division line, look and function very differently than the St. Lawrence head. And some of my questions that get into, the future of the 295 corridor, and knowing that this corridor has been called out there, a lot of things were called out of bounds in Mr. Moulton's response, or I think he called it opinion noted, which is certainly fine. But I think leaving some of those questions about those corridors or other uses hanging are going to make it difficult for Auburn to stake any position that isn't contingent on a number of things. And if, I actually think there was one point, I'm scrolling through, but Nate could probably jump in, that, any recommendation this group makes, it could be a recommendation for further analysis of certain components. And I'm bending more towards recommending to our city management and council further evaluation of certain pieces before any part of the line might be relinquished for something other than trail. And we could talk more about
Other than trail or other than rail?
Other than rail.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification, because I just wanted to note those came in, and those were addressed by DOT staff to back. Those are part of the public record, but also wanted to give people an opportunity to voice their opinions here. So I'm going to ask Dick, put you on the spot a little bit. Are you comfortable with starting with the first one, and we'll just go kind of around the circle on letter A and then go to letter B after that? Are you prepared to talk about where are you right now and what additional information would be helpful? And I'll start the timer on that. Thank you. And I won't start the timer until you start. So.
Clarity, what's letter A?
Better
letter
take a
B?
big breath.
Letter A is, where are you right now, and what additional information would be helpful? And I think we're talking to give DOT staff a direction on what additional information the council would like to see before the public hearing, after the public hearing, or part of their maybe final recommendation.
You're looking at the agenda.
I am looking at the
Apologize.
agenda, letter A.
Is there any copies?
I didn't, I can go make some, but
I'll look
we
online.
can
I can
share.
find it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so you're going to be third, Tony, so you got to be ready. So the timer goes quick, so.
Got it 2:02s backwards for me.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, so Richard?
Okay, so we're looking at three possible uses: freight trains, passenger trains, and a trail. When the state acquired the corridor, there was a contract that said for freight purposes, so just sort of starting for category 1, if it's not being used for freight, they needed to file for it to be abandoned. Every community that asked this group to be appointed specifically said they wanted to see that discontinuance agreement enforced. None of them saw freight as part of their economic development strategies going forward. Turning to passenger. Passenger rail's been studied quite a bit, going from Portland to Lewiston, Auburn. And the studies that have come out for that to date have looked at various corridors, various approaches, and for the most part have concluded first, as to kind of the broad question, are we ready to go ahead with this, was the population densities just don't legitimize, that don't meet the standard of what federal funding requires. So I think it's a long shot that the trains are actually going to happen here. I'm not averse to it. I like the idea. But, you know, I at the moment, I think it hasn't sort of met the federal standard. But then, even if you come to the question, let's have trains, which corridor are you going to put them on? You can either have them come up the CSX corridor and continue up the CSX corridor all the way to Lewiston, Auburn, or you can come up the CSX corridor to Yarmouth Junction, flip over to SLA, to the St. Lawrence Atlantic, and then get back on the CSX corridor for the rest of the way to downtown Yarmouth. Our group thinks that it's not logical to actually jump to the other corridor and then jump back, because it's an unused corridor versus a used corridor. Lots of other reasons. You can't accomplish both things. I'm on my time, but
That'll teach you.
I'm,
We'll be back. We'll be back.
I
to
know,
you.
I am a little troubled with the I do feel like the Casco Bay Trail position has not been able to be fully articulated as well as some of the other positions. So I would like another chance.
Okay. Angela?
I feel that all the information that we've gotten, thank you, from the consultants that they put together as far as previous information, but we want to keep moving along and see how things change. It just makes sense to me that this be trail until rail, because we should be using this public space for the public, and I don't see the rail happening for quite some time if it ever does. So I think trail until rail just makes sense.
And is there any additional information trying to stick to the A, or is there anything you would need at this time?
Well, what Dick mentioned, that, the whole freight thing, I'm not clear on how the other line, how often it is being used or what. So that would be good to know if an already functioning corridor could be used for both. Optimize what we already have versus making this one. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
All right, Tony.
The scope of services has not clearly been defined to state the council is considering only this corridor and should not be confused with MDOT legislative work being done on multiple corridors. In bold, I'll hang this out a little while, the Maine Department of Transportation has engaged the services of the same consultant on all rail studies on the use of these corridors, resulting in a lot of confusion and reflection of the state's lack of a cohesive state rail plan. It is confusing that this council is getting overlapping information. We are charged in determining the best use of this corridor and this corridor specifically. 2, this study is taking place because of an interpretation by the recreational trail interests of the 2019 Lewiston Auburn passenger rail study that the subject railroad is no longer considered valued for use of rail. The main rail transposition is, and we have provided and will continue to provide information to this council and the Maine State Legislature on its position that the 2019 Lewiston Auburn passenger train study is not completed and that no findings should be considered until it is accepted by the legislature and the cities of Auburn and Lewiston that funded it. Now, most critical to us is this whole concept of not identifying train stations, and it's going to take a lot more than 50 seconds to explain to you that last week, the DOT made a statement that is 100% incorrect, where he says, if you identify train stations, you will be disqualified for federal funding. That's incorrect, and it's a misinterpretation of the study. That falls under the category of capital improvement grants, federal funding. We are not in that category here. And if we do not identify train stations that go through 6 towns in a state-owned railroad that serves the largest city in the state of Maine, we are not going to get our correct numbers. We're not going to get our correct economic impact. It's going to look like there's low ridership. If you want to see ridership, I suggest you look at the VHB study for Westbrook to Portland Rail, where they projected 600,000 riders a year on a very similar railroad corridor. And 2 minutes is not enough.
So I'm going to come back to Dick and then to you after we've had one loop around, okay? Hope?
Thank you. I wish I had taken debate in school. But anyway, what I've heard from my community in Falmouth is a resounding support for trail until rail. I have not heard from any constituents in Falmouth otherwise. This has been one of the biggest items that I have actually heard as a council member from my community, support for trail until rail. The documents that we have received support that. There is an alternative for passenger rail. I think there is absolutely room for passenger rail and a need. Greenhouse gas emissions, diesel emissions, if we can get that electric and we can get people on there, great. But I also agree that we don't quite have that density yet to do that. And we certainly don't have that for 2 different lines. And we have an alternative for 1 line. I'm not aware of an alternative for a trail line other than this. And so I think this is actually our opportunity to incorporate an active transit passageway that will help people who live here and want to travel on a bike or walk, and will help people who want to come here as tourists to bring their money into Maine, and they can do this trail and spend money all along the way. So I do think that we should move forward with trail until rail. I think there's a support for that. The financials for doing the train right now are astronomical. Just positive traction control alone is a very, very costly thing to have to implement, and it takes many, many, many years. So in order for us to do that, we'd be looking at probably 10, 20-year project. We can move forward with trail much sooner than that, and it still leaves the opportunity for us to convert to rail later on if we need to. Additionally, all of the communities that are impacted will have a second go-around if the state decides to move forward with this. Each community will evaluate how it will impact them and where funding for that will come from. So we don't have to decide that here. We just have to decide if that's a good option.
Thank you, Hope.
I don't even think we'll need our full 2 minutes. St. Lawrence Atlantic, we sold the line to the state in 2010, filed for discontinuance in 2015. We've worked with the state for the last 7 years to try to extend that. We haven't formally abandoned our freight rights. Obviously, as a freight railroad, we want to retain, the ability to serve customers if they do pop up. So that would be our position. I don't think we have any further questions. I mean, we've been intimately familiar with the property for the last 15 years. So.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to have Nate, if you wouldn't mind grabbing that other microphone, because that one's going to get stretched all the way around the table if we keep going. So thank you.
This mic is exclusively for Nate's.
Yes, it is.
I came into this process just I have a train hat from when I was 2 years old, and I like riding bikes. And my day job is running a nonprofit called Live and Work in Maine. Our job is to partner with state government, local communities, private employers, and attract and retain people here. So we've been doing that since 2015. And so ostensibly, that's the lens I come to this process with. completely unfamiliar with the process and completely unfamiliar with the asset prior to this process. So just for context there, as I've been shopping this around we work with 26 of the largest employers in Maine and a whole bunch more that are not anywhere near the largest in Maine, and from communities, everywhere from the county on down. And I've shopped this around a handful of times, and sort of here's, the consensus seems to be the following, which is that, and I'm not focusing on one outcome over the other. I think it's just worth highlighting because there's some clear and very articulated opinions about one asset over the other. What I wanted to highlight is the fact that Maine's advantage for attracting and retaining people here, it continues to be our quality of life and utilization of unique assets as a general term, whether it's natural or otherwise. Beginning this process, I think everybody around this table, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouths, but I think we can all agree that this is an underutilized asset. And the debate I've heard and the conversation I've heard is about how to utilize that asset. And so that's, without a doubt, that is an underutilized asset, and we'd like to do something with it. And in my mind, and the mind of many employers, by the definition of the fact that they're a private entity, inaction is generally the worst outcome that one can offer, rather than action of some kind. And so the bottom line here is implementation and execution is clearly everything. There's a complex process even after this one winds up that will have to continue. There's not really, my opinion is that there's a clear and organized and actionable constituency that is ready to implement a trail option that does not limit the potential for rail development. What I'd encourage us all to do is not get over our skis here and pretend like we have the ability to actually execute this thing and that our job stops and the process continues no matter what our opinion is. So I'd encourage us to be clear and articulate and know that the process is, and execution and implementation is everything, and that will continue immediately after we resolve our job. So I'm just trying to keep my expectations in check here about what we're capable of doing and when the debate needs to continue.
Thank you, Nate.
No comment from me, of course.
All right. So in my professional capacity at Greater Portland Council of Governments and PACS, the Portland Area Comprehensive Transportation System, represent a number of different municipal interests as well as transit provider interests and other transportation advocates. So, some of my perspective on this is ultimately shaped by the input that has been provided thus far through this group, as well as municipal input provided through other channels in my work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as I jump in. I think there's certainly arguments on both sides of the table here. I think I'm leaning, and again, my final perspective will be shaped by collective input around this table, but I'm leaning towards a trail until rail alternative. I think there's been significant community support around that particular alternative. It's illustrated through the public input we've gotten through this process. Several of the trail segments have been submitted and are currently prioritized in the region's long-range transportation plan, Connect 2045, and that certainly carries a lot of weight in the world of transportation planning and how we're allocating federal transportation dollars in the future. That plan has not been formally adopted yet, so we'll acknowledge that. Certainly there's a financial feasibility and viability piece to this. The capital cost for the trail, we're looking at around $55 million. Operation or maintenance is $100,000 per year. When you stack that against a significant rail investment, we're looking at $200+ million in capital and $2.4 million, 24 times the amount to maintain the tracks. And I do have concerns about, the state's capacity to do that, the ridership, being able to support that level of significant investment and what that type of investment could, what the implications could be for transit providers in the Portland area and beyond. I have some other things to say, but I will pass.
Okay, I'm going to try to follow the assignment. What additional information would be helpful? I will share Cumberland, like Falmouth, is overwhelmingly in support of a trail until rail situation. But the thing that's backwards for me is that in Cumberland, the first step we have always done is basically had a meeting with the abutters that would be impacted by this. When I when I went on the ride with DOT, especially from Yarmouth to Auburn, I was really taken by the number of residential crossings and the proximity of the residential households to the track. And those would have been the first people I would have had at my first meeting to say, let's talk about what might be coming. Let's talk about how you can be involved. VHB did a nice job in giving us some alternatives with landscaping buffers and fencing and those type of things. That was very helpful to me, but that kind of got lost in the message a little bit for me. So I was, you know, my additional information was just, you know, how do we connect with the butters that really have been kind of tuned out of the process? Because if they tuned into any of our meetings, it was tough to watch at times, because I really felt like we were in the middle of a filibuster between rail advocates and trail advocates, and I really wanted them to have a voice at the table, and I don't think they've had an adequate voice at the table. So protection of what happens to property rights is probably the one question I have still outstanding, but I'll skip to the next thought when we get to item B. So I'll pass it this time.
Hello, I'm Brian again from Maine Yacht Center in Portland. Just as a reminder, we do use the railroad track. We have a lease agreement with the state of Maine. We haul boats on a customized bit of equipment about a half a mile on the tracks from our waterfront location to an off-site storage location on Presumpscot Street. So we're in the railroad business. So we don't take a stand either way. Rail and trail is supported by Maine Yacht. Trail before rail is supported. I think what's important to us is that we're still able to somehow maintain in some sort of coexisting way that last bit of track for our use. It is important to our business model. It does give people in Portland access to waterfront recreation that would otherwise not have it if we weren't able to offer that service. So that's my little plug for still being able to maintain some actual rail use at that one section of track. And I do have a question about, I don't really understand exactly the mechanics of how our recommendation, and when we make our final recommendation, are we required to quantify or qualify in some way the VHB capital cost study, or is that not considered part of our recommendation or decision-making process?
Sorry, so I mean like approve the study, or?
No, are we required to analyze in any way or quantify or qualify whether $50 million capital cost for a trail is a reasonable thing for the next governing body to consider as appropriate for the use?
Yeah. So this, do you want me to respond? Or?
Yeah,
So the statute is not very prescriptive, right? You can really, the recommendation is up to you. The VHB study is just some background information. You know, it could be as simple as a sentence, we support X alternative. So that so the answer is no. However, if the committee wants to, you certainly could. Yeah.
Natalie.
So I guess I'll just start by saying I was kind of thrown into this fairly recently when we lost our town manager, and I've taken some time to really get caught up on what's going on, but I don't know that there's been any community output put out to see what New Gloucester residents want. And I did talk to one of our select board members this morning before this meeting, and it seems like someone had gone to the select board a little over a year ago and asked about this exact thing, and they didn't want to take any action because they wanted to get more information, but it doesn't seem like any information was ever really gone out. So I don't feel comfortable making a stance on behalf of the town without actually doing any, consensus of what the town might want.
Scott? Diane, I'm going to have you use Nate's.
Awesome, thank you. So folks in Yarmouth shared a very similar thought to both Cumberland and Falmouth. Overwhelming support for a trail until rail concept. In fact, I mean, one of the counselors or former counselors, made mention during the meeting where this was sort of, talked about that it was the most overwhelming support that they've seen for any project ever to come in front of them, which is not difficult to see. There was a lot of really passionate folks about that. To answer the first question on additional information. I don't know if there's really more information. I'm a little bit troubled by the 2018 data sets. I just don't think that they're super representative current day, both from a ridership perspective and for a sort of the economic impact study that was installed. I mean, there's just a lot of concerns about sort of the density and the use types programming the space that was outlined in the economic impact study. It just doesn't match what we would allow in our current regs. So I'd have some concerns about that. But in general, I think that there's a real opportunity here to, first and like very rarely have our cake and eat it too, where we're able to sort of advise policy that can help facilitate an active transportation line while supporting commuter rail opportunities on the CSX line. So I think this is a really great opportunity for us to kind of look at ourselves and try to leverage a really underutilized asset, as Nate mentioned. And I think, again, from what we hear sort of locally in Yarmouth, that would be to, again, rail until trail concept with a sort of an eye towards the CSX lines for commuter rail. So, thanks. Is that right on to you?
10 seconds.
Woo! I didn't do debate either.
I've
got it. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's provided information to this council on both sides of the issue. I've learned a lot, more than I ever thought I would. I really enjoyed the ride on the rail. That was an eye-opener. This is the second municipality that I've worked for that has had overwhelming support in the form of a resolution to the Casco Bay Trail Alliance for trail to rail. And my community I'm working for now has that support. I just think that it's an underutilized asset, which has been mentioned today. If we do nothing and wait for rail, it's still going to be underutilized when we could use it for whatever time period we can if rail ever comes back. I support rail, but I also support using something that we have to the benefit of our community. In the last 2 years, going through COVID, as probably Bill, you'll know, have recreation, recreation's exploded around the state. And whatever we can do to get people out in the community, out on the trails, doing whatever they can, I think that that's the way we need to focus right now. Focus today, dealing with what we know today, and then if the future takes us to trail, I'm in support of that. But right now, representing my community and everything that I've learned to date, I support the trail to rail. I also echo what Bill said about the abutters. I don't know how we do that, but whatever decision that comes out of this and wherever it goes moving forward, whether it's rail or whether it's trail, I think the abutters need to have a voice at the table, and I think that's what's been missing through this process.
Okay, so if you want another round of this, we'll do one more time around the table for those who felt they didn't finish. Jeremiah, Jonathan, Richard, and Tony. You have 11 seconds now.
We haven't started.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was
Two
cutting.
largest cities in the room.
Well, we know what your point is.
I come here, frankly, a bit frustrated. Again, I feel like, what this conversation kind of is not taking the bigger picture into context. We are on the precipice of a climate crisis. I don't think anyone here at the table really understands what that's going to mean and what changes that has coming for us. It's easy, especially for those of us who've never seen these sorts of things, to sort of stand by and not be concerned about it. I am deeply skeptical about the idea that if it's a trail until rail, that it will have some ease of reuse. I'm just skeptical of that. I think if as soon as we attempt to discontinue an asset, it is gone. I think that the largest city in the state, quite frankly, could strongly benefit from a dual-use facility. So at this time, my leaning is toward a rail with trail understanding what type of investment and commitment that could mean from the state. But this is a state that has spent over $100 million on a needless expansion of 395, contemplating $200 million for a needless expansion to Gorham. So the money is there. The money exists. It's just a matter of what we're committed to and what we're interested in doing. I still don't feel like I know enough about larger initiatives and larger outcomes to even have a realistic expectation of rail. But I really cannot stomach the idea of setting ourselves up to lose that facility in the future.
So I'm going to follow the homework assignment, so information that could be helpful. Some of this was referenced in my questions that weren't answered, but I would defer to PACS and others. The 295 study that was done in the mid-2000s, there was a clear aversion, both because there's no money nor a political interest with climate change even then to widen 295. Obviously, without widening 295, any attempt to do bus rapid transit is non-existent because they'd be sitting in that congestion. The corridor, the St. Lawrence corridor was seen as a preferred alternative. If there's going to be a walking away from that corridor, I think it's important for posterity to be seeing a statement from PACS and the Portland region that they do not wish to see those services available in the future. With respect to Portland to Lewis and Auburn passenger rail service, we still don't know whether CSX would allow passenger trains to run. Given their operating model, do we actually think we could achieve the frequency that was contemplated in the 2018 study? Do we know the engineering constraints on that corridor to build sidings appropriate to accommodate the movement of the freight trains and the passenger trains to pass one another, even if we're running on a Downeaster style 5 to 6 times a day? We don't have that information. We didn't talk a lot about why the line was acquired. There was a negotiation with extension of passenger rail service to Lewis and Auburn occurring at the same time the Brunswick planning was happening in the late 2000s. This line was acquired as the state was lining up the construction money to build the Downeaster. In addition to the acquisition, there was a verbal commitment made by Maine DOT and the Baldacci administration to Lewis and Auburn and our legislators that a Y would be constructed at the St. Lawrence split to allow for the ease of movement of trains from one corridor to the other there, as opposed to just crossing at Danville. That Y was never constructed. I don't know if there were cost estimates or designs, but that's outstanding. It'd be good to understand the state of that. We don't have the state rail plan draft. We should see that for context, as Jeremiah referenced. We don't have the transit plan draft for the state. That's all part of the state long-range plan. We should see that. In terms of freight, we have not really had this is all just asking for information. I guess I can put it in writing.
I was going to ask if folks felt if we should do 3 minutes on the second round, because there are a few people here that have a lot to say, and I think it's important to those of us who are here today to listen to all. So I'm okay with that. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time as well. So I will do one more round around. Do people feel comfortable with 2 minutes? Or
you want to start? I'm happy.
I will start with you, so you can continue.
Yeah, and none of this is even getting into how Auburn might articulate or carve out a position, but I could probably end getting close to that. On the freight side, again, it's out of this group's purview, but it all relates to the state corridor that we own right now. It's highly unlikely that CSX is going to have interest in playing around at the Port of Portland, which, as we all know, is growing. So the extent to which opportunities for further intermodal or even the connections to Montreal might emerge in the future, CSX is not going to want to make a short play from Portland to Auburn or then on to Montreal, which means we would need a short line partner that could perhaps have some operating agreement on the CSX line. They're going to run a 3-mile train once a day. There'll be windows in between where cargo could be picked up from Ameskip in Portland and then moved north from there. Having that corridor to be able to do that, again, that Y at Yarmouth would be important because you wouldn't stay on the St. Lawrence line because, as we know, it doesn't get itself into Portland. But there would be a means to briefly use the CSX main line to meet that. Understanding that, again, important to making a decision. And lastly, we have a cost of the trail until rail which I've heard folks describe, hey, if rail comes back, we don't have a cost of trail to rail. Because when I look at the cost estimates, we talk about restoration of freight costing $22 million. We talk about trail until rail being $55 million. Well, one, if it's going to go back to rail, but we've had trail for 15 years, that trail's going to have to go somewhere. So it almost starts to lend itself to, well, if we're playing the long game and we don't want to have to spend money twice, we might be better off doing trail with rail. And the reality is the state owns the corridor, so the typical arguments that might emerge from a freight operator of, I don't want that in my right-of-way, is moot, because the state can say, if you want to use our right-of-way, you play by our rules. And it'd be interesting to at least see the cost of, if we were talking about a trail corridor, what would it cost to turn that back into a modern freight corridor?
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, second round. If you would like to go again, we'll start around. Richard?
There's currently a passenger train that comes up from Boston, goes through Portland, comes up to, passes through Yarmouth, goes to stops in Freeport and Brunswick. It's on a line that's owned by CSX. It's used amicably for both passenger service and freight service. Neither has a huge number of trains that they're using, so the sharing of the line, the efficient use of the line is well demonstrated on that corridor. When you look at the only two options that are being considered for Portland to Lewiston Auburn trains, both use the CSX line for a lot of it. They either come up from Portland Transportation Center to Yarmouth Junction and then switch over the SLA line and go back onto the CSX corridor, or they just stay on the CSX corridor all the way through. There's strong precedent for having this shared arrangement for freight use and passenger use on the same line. This is an incredible opportunity for us to accomplish both public purposes by prioritizing the line that makes more sense for trains and the other line that makes more sense as a trail. The other thing that I just want to emphasize is how much this idea of making this a trail is part of a regional and a statewide vision for trail development that is going to fundamentally improve and build on Maine's quality of place. I mean, it's what Nate described. I mean, there's this report that we put out, the Maine Active Transportation Arterials Plan, that connects every one of Maine's 25 largest municipalities with an active transportation trail. This piece of that is critical, and it's just not stopping trains from happening because we have the other corridor. It's an incredible opportunity we have that I'm going to be really sad if we pass it up.
Thank you, Richard.
I agree with Dick. I just think this makes so much sense. I have nothing more to say.
And we'll leave that mic that way, if you could push it
Over
back.
here, first, listen to people coming around the room. Jeremy hit the nail on the head, by the way, and climate change is among us. If we do not step up to the plate, we all will suffer. We are already suffering. This is about climate change. I want to make something very, very clear to Mr. Woodbury. I mean, no, I should say he made it very clear to us. This is not about trail until rail. Say it again. This is about trail, period. Second part of that is there is no such thing, and not referenced in this report anywhere, the term trail until rail. The term used is interim trail use. Interim trail use is clearly defined as removal of the infrastructure. Jonathan, it's never going back. A couple other people in the room, it's never going back. Dick gets what he wants. Now, what is clear here is the state of Maine Department of Transportation is refusing to consider the state of Maine-owned rail for passenger rail transit. They are refusing. In fact, they have adopted in their 3-year budget the active transportation program funded to the tune of $280,000, and it is defined as rail to trail. If this same $250,000, which I just heard we're not even going to use it, we're looking at other things, that this consultant got was used to pay for a real, can we do this train plan, then maybe these answers would come. Is it too much? Is it more than that road out to Gorham or that new bridge they just put into Portland? Is it more than what we spend on roads at 800,000 miles, lane mile per year? Is the cost more? You will never know, because this consultant got false information from MDOT in their scope of services, creating a study that is 100% showing you we got to do trails because we can't do trains here. Progressives, we just won the state. We have Congress. We are progressives. We are not looking back. We are not ripping up our most valuable infrastructure. We are looking to the future, and the future is a battery electric or fully electric or hybrid electric passenger train service that's going to deal with the 50,000 cars coming into Portland every day on I-295. It's going to deal with this fact that nobody's buying electric cars. We have to convert the way we live. We have a chance to do this right now. We can do this. The most upsetting thing about this whole roundtable in these trails people is anybody who says we can't do this. I just came back from doing it. We're doing this, period. We can, and we are, and we may need to tell DOT to change the way they're doing things.
Thank you, Tony.
If we don't have the state's support, it's not going to happen. So if Tony is right and Maine DOT is not interested and not willing, it's a moot point. But I don't think that's our point to debate right now. Yes, climate change is, I think, the most important topic that we should all be talking about at every single level. And we are not talking about, let's put everybody in a single occupancy vehicle. We are talking about, let's have a passenger rail that's already partially in place, that we can improve upon, that we can really target to get people on, and let's have an active transit rail. What I would like to know, and we don't have the information on, and I'm not sure if anybody's looked at it, maybe we did have it and I missed it, but there are now predictions in the latest Scientific American from the November edition that within 10 years we could actually have that 10-foot sea level increase because of what's happening in Antarctica, which I'm going to go visit in a few weeks. And what I want to know is, if we do have that 10-foot sea level rise, will that impact one of the lines that we're looking at for the rail? Because if, in fact, one would be underwater and one wouldn't, then that would be a moving factor for me from the climate change impact. Otherwise, I think where I'm hearing a majority going is that climate-wise, it's better for us to have the two options, to have passenger rail on one and to have active transit on the other. So another thing that I don't know, and I know that people have different opinions on whether or not it would ever go back. And we heard from the public last time that the reason why it hasn't gone back in other places is because people don't want it. But what is the cost estimate if we have that? If it is a trail, what the cost estimate is to go to what it would need to be for electric versus where it is right now and the conversions that would have to be made, the positive traction control conversions, the electric lines, the stations, all of that, we'd have to, the cost. I'm not sure if the cost estimates that we have are for electric.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add, guys. I would say just kind of as an observer, I would kind of ask the question, has anyone ever talked to CSX about adding passenger train sets to their line? It's early days of their acquisition. They've inherited a lot of legacy agreements. I would just be curious what their appetite is, and it's something to think about.
Thank you. Nate?
So I'm just reminded by our conversation last month, about what our job is and what our job is not. And just hearing some opinions around the table, it's pretty, my opinion on opinions is that folks have very articulated opinions at this point, whether based on their constituency or based on their own beliefs. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that we've all got an opportunity to include those opinions in our final report, and that our outcome here is that. It's a set of opinions that is going to guide the process moving forward. But a lot of the questions, like I've got some technical questions. If we are in the implementation process. But unless I'm misunderstood something from our statutory obligations here, we are not in implementation. We are in consideration of options. And the output that we are expected to deliver is a set of opinions based on the conversation and research that we've undertaken. So I just wanted to, on the record here, a huge thanks to DOT for, in good faith, answering questions that they've been sent and taking us on a ride. That was a lot of fun and also very informative. And I think that's the output here for me is one of satisfaction in that we've been given every opportunity to both ask the questions we've wanted to ask, to talk with one another, both here and elsewhere, and to be literally hands-on or wheels-on, as it were, with what the asset is and what the asset is not. And so I think we're at the point, my observation here is that in order to drive action, we all have the opportunity to articulate these opinions. We sort of staked our place in the ground. My open question to all of us would be, what more can we say in order to drive a different outcome than a set of opinions? And that's as much of me imploring us as it is stating for the record that we are not going to sway opinions in this group, nor is it our job to sway opinions. It's our job to articulate where our constituencies stand.
Thank you, Nate.
Chairman, can I put a question out on the floor?
Sure.
As folks go around, or maybe people can come back.
Question from Jonathan on the mic.
Yeah, a question for those who have opinions on trail until rail or interim trail use. What do you see as the merits or the pros and cons of doing trail with rail versus trail until rail? Like, is there a nuance there, or is it just cost? Just to understand those that are supportive of a trail outcome, how you'd view trail with rail. Just put it out. I would be interested to understand that from folks' perspective.
And I think we're going to come back to that once we finish the loop here, so I'll try to be respectful of people's time as well. So, Chris, I think you're next.
All right. I don't have a ton more to add than what's already been stated by folks in this room and what I've already mentioned. Did want to acknowledge and thank Maine DOT for their leadership in this process. I think it's been a fair process. I think it's been open. At times, particularly in the Zoom world, it felt a little hectic at times, but we're getting through it. And want to thank VHB and RKG for their efforts as well, and our fearless chair for guiding the process.
Guiding is a strong word.
I know it's not. I know it's not always easy.
Herding cats.
I do agree with what folks said, that this is a tremendously important and underutilized asset, and one that could be utilized in the short term if if a certain set of decisions were made and funding was made available to implement. I do understand the comments about implementation and how that can be perhaps outside the scope of this group, but I think it's important to consider the financial feasibility and the viability of any alternative if we are making an informed recommendation to the commissioner in this case. So I do think it's important to consider implementation as part of this effort, and want to also acknowledge the importance of obviously climate change and public health as two huge crises facing our nation and our state and region. Diane Barnes mentioned outdoor recreation, how that's exploded during the pandemic, and in prior roles that I've had in healthcare systems, physicians will tell you, try to treat health issues upstream so they don't become tremendous issues downstream, and that's what public health's all about, and outdoor recreation is one way to help create healthier Mainers.
Thank you, Chris. I don't have a ton to add. I think it's a good question, Jonathan, the trail with rail option, and why people are kind of teetering on that option versus one or the other. I think the difficulty that VHB showed us and those who went on the ride is, I don't know if there's enough room to do it. I mean, they've shown there is, but those of us who went on the ride were curious, especially at some of the bridge crossings and other obstacles along the way, especially some of the cantilevered slopes and other things. So, but it's that compromise option that some of us want to kind of have both sides. And I had spent 2 weeks in Europe, and I came home and said, how did we get it so wrong? I mean, you look at every option there. I mean, they've got trails and bike paths on the same route that the buses go in Europe, because the buses don't travel every minute of the day. They've got schedules, and there's plenty of room for the bikes on the bus trails. So I was just awestruck by transportation when I was in Europe, and I just came home and said, how did we get it so wrong? They don't build extra lanes on highways. They figure out a way to make it work, and they figure out how to get more people on trams and buses and trains, and it works primarily because of the density of the population as well. So there are some things that, you know, we're not going to fix here in the United States. We're not going to squish everybody together into one community, but it's just missed opportunity if DOT has given us these options, I think, to try to do both if it's possible. And physically, I came away with, I don't know if it'll fit on the same corridor, but, you know, there are detours along the way that a trail could get pushed out to and then come back to the rail bed as well. That wouldn't be too difficult, I think. But for me, I don't know. I know what the citizens here haven't had the opportunity to ride it, haven't had the opportunity of these discussions. They think about the recreation purpose, and we were one of the few communities that didn't close our parks during the pandemic. We left them all open, and we monitored parking lots. And when the parking lots got over 75%, that's when we closed it down. But you're right, Diane, it is about offering that, and I think a lot of our folks would be really happy to see this as a trail, but I think there is some missed opportunity.
Thankfully, I'm not a municipal officer or a member of city government, and these are problems that smarter people than I am going to have to solve. But I'll throw just a couple things out there. I remember wasn't so long ago when St. Lawrence and Atlantic operated on that line, and it was the third Thursday of every month that a train would come carrying beans into the B&M lot, which we know that's all gone now. So I do remember when it was used. It was underused, obviously. I know Eldridge Lumber tried to get lumber delivered to their yard on Brezumska Street, but it happened just as St. Lawrence and Atlantic was leaving the rail. And so, but I also see it as an underutilized asset, and I could see how valuable it would be to Portland and to all the towns along the line for people to be able to access that for biking or walking to end up at the waterfront. I mean, who doesn't want to take an afternoon bike ride or a weekend walk with their kid and wind up at the waterfront? I mean, the waterfront's always a draw, right? And so our position is, you know, we want to work with whatever eventuality happens, because everybody would sort of wind up at the main yacht center, because that's kind of the end. And I don't really know what that would look like, but I do know what I always think about when I think about this is I think of Belfast, and I think of the Front Street Shipyard, which was a large shipyard that was developed in Belfast, which was a boom to the town of Belfast. But the Front Street Shipyard developers worked with the city of Belfast, and there's a wonderful walking trail that's city property that meanders right through the shipyard as it carries on up the river. It just seemed like a really nice way to get people out and through the shipyard and to the waterfront on the other side. And so I just see all sorts of opportunity, and we just will support whatever the eventuality is.
That was a rail to trail. The train used to go right down to the waterfront down there.
In Belfast?
Oh, yeah. You don't recall that, huh?
No, I definitely don't recall that.
Are you passing?
I have nothing to say.
Okay, great.
That doesn't mean you get four minutes.
I was going to say, I don't need 4 minutes. I don't need it. Well, I think to sort of address the climate action piece that's been going around, totally agree, and I don't think anybody would disagree at this group. I don't think that there's a silver bullet solution for transportation issues in Greater Portland and in Maine in general. I mean, I think it's going to be a combination of uses that's going to address the climate action needs that we have, and so that's going to be, I see this as a real opportunity to have meaningful commuter rail access on sort of leveraging an existing line while having a passive, active transportation corridor here, which again, I mean, last time I checked, biking and walking don't produce carbon emissions, you know, as an alternative with the 295 corridor, in addition to bus fleets and anything else that we might be creative enough to find in the future to Bill's earlier point. So that's that. To answer Jonathan's question, at least from Yarmouth's perspective, it's always been sort of the physical constraints, to Bill's point. We're sort of unique in, from the other communities, that the St. Lawrence Atlantic bisects our main street. And so there is a real concern from folks in Yarmouth of the safety and accessibility of our main street in the village core. Investing millions of dollars into enhanced streetscape to make it a safer place for people to bike, walk, and drive. We also have, $75+ million in new development that are really sort of supportive of an active transportation line of rail line on this road. I think for us, it's been a combination of efforts and interests, private development interests, that have really sort of shaped our perspective on this. And so, am I at 2 minutes? Pretty good. So thanks. Leave that for Natalie.
So I really don't have a whole lot to add. I just wanted to touch on Jonathan's question. I think it's two-part for me. Number one is what Bill said, after riding along the rail, I don't know how it would be feasible to have trail along the rail. In certain spots you could, I suppose. But I think the glaring thing for me is we have the asset now that's not being used. It's underutilized. And I think it still comes back to that. And obviously, I know people around the table, some, not everybody, think that if it goes to trail, it will never be rail again. If that was the case, then why would we have these restrictions when we go to trail, that it had, with the understanding that if rail came back, it would have to go to rail. We'd have to convert it back to rail. So somewhere in somebody's mind in the future, rail may come back, or else we wouldn't have those restrictions. And, the Sunrise Trail in down East Maine, that's a perfect example, and that's been a trail for a very long time, and I don't know if rail's ever been considered to come back, but what a great trail, and it's being utilized now. And had that not been built as a trail, I just think of the economic benefits up in that region that could certainly use it. But that was a great opportunity for them, and I see a great opportunity for us. But I don't disagree with a dual option. I just don't think it's feasible.
You guys share that one right there with you, Jonathan, Jeremiah. Sorry about that. Just grab it. It's got a lot of weight on the end, a lot of lines still left. There we go. Thank you, Jonathan.
At the end of the day, yeah, this is an underutilized asset, and I think we want to see the most we can out of it. I think it's a fair question to ask, what would it take to have both? I think it's an absolutely fair question. Portland for years has been trying to certainly have a high-quality bicycle pedestrian connection to the north. We most recently had a planning study administered through PACS a few years ago, and to be blunt, Maine DOT thwarted us at every turn at trying to complete an adequate outcome. So I come here frustrated again that I sort of feel like we're getting sort of pushed into a corner on another process. So, after a lot of years of thoughtful input on the city of Portland's part. So, I struggle with the idea of very likely taking something out of service completely. I understand that rules and regulations can be written in. I also know what political realities can be on the ground, and politics trumps everything. It just does.
So in fairness to VHB, I thought there was a priced out option for a rail and trail. I mean, my recollection was like I thought it was 122 for some reason. I don't know why that number's, but there is an option on the table. So it was considered as part of our information. It was presented by VHB, and
Sounds good to me then.
okay. Well, I don't want people to think that
I don't think there was a rail option.
there was an option. It was.
There was a design, any kind of design for a rail with trail option. There was
So
maybe a
let's-
sketch given in a meeting too, but.
No, there was a price, Tony.
There
There
were
was a
costs
price,
for it.
there were costs. Do you want to answer that, Nate, or Nate?
Sure,
let you guys-
absolutely. Yeah, both costs. So, rail until trail was in there, and the rail with the trail. Both of those costs were in the report. Those were provided, so yes.
Can we answer that question specifically today? I know I don't want to just hijack the meeting, but it would be nice so that everybody heard the same information. And what were some of the constraints, or I'll call it little asterisks, by going to a rail and trail? Because I remember that was presented, so. Do you guys mind? Can you push that down?
Pulling up the numbers here in just a second.
Okay, we are looking for the numbers, and then I'd like to basically quickly just go around the table. If you're ready, say which option you'd like to see. If you're not, you can pass at this point. I'm going to choose to pass, to be honest with you. But I do want to wait to hear what the public has to say in December, and I don't want to make a decision until after that December 5th meeting, because I think we're going to see a lot of people show up. I really do.
I understand, though, this report's gonna come out, then the public hearing. Did I hear
Right, that is
earlier?
correct.
So the public's gonna be fed, in my opinion, a lot of misinformation, and I have it documented. There's misinformation.
That's your opinion,
No,
Tony, and
no,
I'm
I have it
respecting it,
documented.
and I,
Not an opinion, I have it documented. It's documented misinformation. So we got a problem writing a report based on misinformation. Be like a couple examples, I'll give them to you. But we can't be sending a report out to the public that has misinformation.
so VHB, are you guys ready?
Yeah, so just to hit the alternatives, so the restoration of freight service, we had the low and the high on that. So the low was 13.4 million, the high was 31.
And
then-
that was for just freight service on the
Yep, that's
existing line?
just freight. And then for passenger, the total cost for that was 274 million.
Can I just ask a clarification on this? It was in my questions. People should know, that's not for the Berlin subdivision piece of that. That's to get to downtown Lewiston with $100 million of bridge projects in downtown Lewiston, Auburn. It's just important for folks. The 274 is not to get you to Danville Junction from the main yacht center. That 274 is to go from the Portland Transportation Center relocated to downtown Lewiston at the historic station.
That's from milepost 0 in Portland to milepost 26 is the two, yeah, is basically Danville Junction.
Reconstruction of Swing Bridge
Yeah.
to the back.
And it includes a rail with a trail, and you've priced that all out, because I can't find that.
No, that's passenger,
No, that's just passenger.
Passenger service that's
just
not even
passenger.
Yeah.
That's passenger.
Oh, yeah, forget freight.
Yeah.
I don't care about freight. A passenger transit rail service with a trail next to it, I don't see that
But
price.
you used
No.
the economic analysis from the VHB study for passenger rail to Lewiston, Auburn, and overlaid that with the capital investment that isn't the project under consideration?
Yes, I'll say it for you.
That's.
We know the study. Jonathan and I have read this study in detail.
Say that, the economic analysis went to Danville Junction also, plus a half mile of buffer.
Yeah.
You did a completely different analysis than what the actual proposal that was
Both the economic analysis and the cost estimates went to milepost
So
26.5.
there's a study going
plus or
on
minus
right
an
now
extra
that's a
half mile.
follow-on to the 2018 Lewiston, Auburn to Portland study
Yeah.
that VHB is also doing. But the economic analysis and capital that you've made part of this process is for a completely different type of service on a completely different corridor? Because
Well, the cost
the
estimate-
18 study talked about going from the Portland Transportation Center
Yeah.
and assumed a relocation, as it talked about travel times and the like, to an area around exit 75 and then downtown Lewiston, Auburn. That was the conclusion of the 18 study. And
Yep.
it was for direct service. There was no stop in suburbs. It was Lewiston, Auburn to Portland. The follow-on to that on the economic analysis is looking at, again, the Portland Transportation Center to Yarmouth. It's contemplating either using the Berlin subdivision or CSX, somewhere around exit 75 and then somewhere downtown. You're talking about going from 0.0 at Ocean Gateway to Danville, and you're costing that out and doing an economic, and it just seems strange that we're not contemplating what the state's actually studying with this process. I want to hear Nate, maybe Nate can
I'm
help.
just going to jump in on a couple things. Number one, this doesn't go to Danville Junction. We don't own to Danville Junction. We own to a bridge on the, short of the junction. So, it's on the Great New Gloucester Auburn Town Line, I think.
Not
is what it is. So, yeah, it's not even
No,
into
but-
Auburn. It's
But
to,
the, but the 274 number, which is very close to what the 2018 Lewis and Auburn to Portland passenger rail study had, you're talking about establishing a passenger service from the Ocean Gateway, rebuilding the bridge over Back Cove, and then stopping at the town line.
Yeah, that's the 274.
that's the corridor under consideration.
That's 274,
But-
not.
So we're not even considering the study that's going on right now with a whole other set of stakeholders looking at use of this corridor. We're assuming some other
Those
non-
numbers you're Tony,
Tony,
can I finish, please? The numbers you're contemplating are in that 2018, 2019 study into downtown Lewiston, Auburn. So they're carving that piece out.
Yeah.
So that does exist. You can go, it's on the website.
And you designed in that cost, rail, passenger rail with a trail in the corridor. And that's how you established that price.
No, that
Rail
that
with
274 does not.
That's
That
just
that was the
passenger.
question.
274 is just
So, you haven't answered
passenger.
the question.
274 is just passenger.
Just
Just give me these
So
pages.
what is the final number, the rail with trail number?
And might I interject at this point, please?
Wait 1 second. Let's finish,
Yeah.
let's hear what the last number
So-
was.
So the trail until rail for the gravel was 47.5 million, and the paved path is 55. And the rail with trail is, for the gravel, the total cost is 90 million, and the paved is 94.3.
And that does not include any restoration of passenger rail or
Right.
freight rail. It's
Yep.
just putting the trail adjacent.
Yep, and
So leaving the
preserving the
existing-
future potential for rail.
Wait a minute,
Yeah.
it doesn't.
So in essence, it's like double the cost, trail until rail, you double the cost to get rail with trail. Just for a trail.
Get clarification on
Yep.
that number. That,
Yep.
the bridges that seem to be very narrow, is that
Yes.
expanding those bridges?
Yeah, that's where the cost doubles with rail with trail versus trail until rail, because you have retaining walls, you have to widen bridges, you have to do, and that isn't to say that with a more detailed feasibility study, you couldn't theoretically look at on-road connections, but our charge in the scope of work was a cost to do a rail with trail within the state corridor. So that's roughly what that cost is.
And can we just clean up some of the I've been operating all along assuming that we were pulling in the capital and economic analysis from Auburn, the Portland study. And I just, this is gonna, when I bring this to the Auburn and Lewiston city councils and to others, it's gonna get confusing now looking at extra pieces, that's all.
So let's ask for the additional information to just represent that and to make sure that's within the scope of what this council is supposed to be looking at, and there is no overlap with other studies. So what they presented was the numbers, I believe, that VHB just presented to us. Scott? Microphone, because nobody at home will hear you, sorry.
Just a point of clarification and remind me, so there isn't a total then for a rail with trail concept with the rail rehabilitated to support passenger rail, correct? That total does not exist?
We don't have that.
10-4, thank you.
That's the one piece of information we do not have.
You could add
I was going to say, so it would just be sort of as easy as that?
there could be a little differentiation.
Sure.
This is literally just adding.
Great, thank you.
You can't add A plus B plus C, you can't.
Not
You should know
literally
that.
adding.
We'll talk about that tomorrow at the conference, I'm sure.
Not
See.
literally adding.
Wait a minute, I just want to respond to Jonathan's question about rail with trail, because you heard me say there's no such thing as rail until trail, there's no such thing, Dick's way, gone. You hear my say, I'm saying I'm going for rail, but there is a way for rail with trail, but we have not examined it, and DOT, again, has not examined it. And it requires a planning development process, by the way, that falls under that's a federal language, planning development process, that we cannot exclude the rail. So you gotta look at you gotta say, okay, can we make a train run on this? And we've heard from a lot of people, and if you can we do a trail? Well, you can do both, but often not in the corridor. The train feeds the trails, just like it feeds all modes of transportation at the train station sites. So if we don't go to Yarmouth and say, hey, what do you think about a train station site that feeds a trail and a bike path and a pedestrian walkway and a bus and Uber and all this? If we don't look at that full design, we don't have the answers we're looking for here, and we're not doing it. And one of the reasons we're not doing it, I'm gonna pass this around a little bit, is because the Maine Department of Transportation is stating that we cannot, because we're looking for federal funding, I got this quote here. Because we're looking for federal funding, we cannot consider train stations. But wait a minute, folks, we're not looking for federal funding, we're deciding use. So excuse me, Nate, but I'm gonna quote you, because I took my time watching this video this morning. You say that we've gotta go through the NEPA environmental process to identify train stations. Well, no, you don't, not in a planning process for CIG, that's capital improvement grants from the federal government. You go through a planning development process first. In fact, existing railroad corridors with infrastructure in place are most often exempt from environmental impact analysis. What is not exempt is the train station locations. So this study is flawed in that without identifying train station locations, you can't do environmental impact, you can't determine these numbers you're talking about right now, you can't go intermodal, you cannot use the entire corridor for a trail.
So,
Only where appropriate.
Tony, I'd like to ask Nate Moulton, why couldn't the two numbers be added? Because we have a option of 90 to 94 million that says a co-location of a trail and rail with no rehab to the rail. If you added that to, pick your number, 13 to 31 for freighter and 274 for passenger, why can't those two numbers be added, or is there more to that?
Giving enough detail.
I'm just asking Nate Moulton.
So at high level, which these are, very high level, we have done no engineering, no, this is not an engineering study, it's a high-level assessment. So, plus or minus probably 30% on these numbers. Is that close, Tim? That sounds about right. I'm not an engineer, order of magnitude. So within that, I would say, yeah, you're probably pretty close by putting those
So
two together.
360 plus
Will there be
million.
some tweaks where you might have stations, or you might have some other railroad facility, that type of thing? Absolutely. Or where there's double track or those types of things. But we haven't considered those things because we don't have a service design because we don't have a service. Those are further steps. Again, this is just a evaluation, very high level to date. So the assumption is, and keep in mind, just for the trail estimates, that is using kind of the DOT rail with trail policy, and with the offsets of minimum of 15 feet, or an exception of within 10-foot 6 with the fence in some places. So all that is based on that. And again, if you went off corridor in places, you might be able to save some money. There may be some places where you absolutely have to. You're right. I mean, you're going to extend a very deep old stone box column. I mean, there's a lot of things once you get into the engineering you'd have to look hard at. But again, these are concept level items of discussion. And that goes back to some of the answers on the question. We're at a very high level, and we start talking about details, whether it be passenger, freight, analysis, how far we go out, those types of things. Those are part of a much bigger in-depth study. And I'll put out there, if this committee figures that they don't have enough information, they should come back with that. But part of these corridor councils, as it was set up, and they're all set up the same, is that we provide some background information for the group to chew on. That's
So-
what we've done. Hopefully it's not a pass-fail. Maybe it is, and you can say it fails, and the DOT did lousy work, and we couldn't make a decision. That's fine. That can be your recommendation.
So,
But we are not going to do in-depth studies. That's part of this.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to
I still have
Hope
1 second.
and Dick, and then I'm going to basically, have everybody look at their agenda for the next steps, or draft feasibility report expected around November 28th, our public meeting at the Performing Arts Center here in Cumberland, and then we'll have to basically look for that December meeting, and we're not going to do that today. We're going to figure out what, if people are comfortable meeting the 22nd, we'll meet on the 22nd. If we don't have a majority of folks, then we'll push it to another date. I think that's the easiest, so we can stick with that. So Hope and then Dick, and then we're going to go to public comment.
Do we have
Could
a-
use the microphone, Hope, because people can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Do we have a time estimate on how long it would take to do the rail with trail, with passenger rail? Because I think that everybody seems to be the most enthusiastic about passenger rail. Did you have a rough idea about that?
What's
For
the question?
the time estimate to,
For construction?
yeah.
Are you looking for a construction estimate, Hope, for a time? For
That's
okay,
tough.
yeah.
That-
The
A couple of
planning-
years, or 3 years,
planning,
5 years, 10
construction.
years?
Well, if everything went perfectly, like you could get all that level of funding, correct, right? Yeah, I'm not gonna, environmental permitting, we don't know. To run a rail system, you need equipment. How long is it gonna take you to get electrified equipment? You know, do we have the substations in place to electrify the line? I mean, there's,
10 years? 20 years?
Use the mic, Tom.
We expanded from Portland to Brunswick after we received the funding, 3 years.
But did that include a trail and include the expansion of bridges to be able to fit trail and rail? I mean, there are a lot of
Freight
complications.
mainline, oh, I'm sorry.
Hold that. So I'm assuming that this is going to, if we do them together, and this is trying to address the question of why aren't people saying trail with rail? Because I think that the time estimate and the cost estimate make it infeasible, but I don't know for sure what the time estimate might be. So I was just trying to narrow that down.
Both in a decade was the answer from Jonathan, so.
My answer is, you gotta wanna do it first.
You gotta wanna do it first, is Tony and Dick, the last word, so thank you.
Rail with trail is a compelling option if we're confident we're going ahead with both, that we want both public purposes happening, and if we only had one corridor on which to do both things. This whole rail with trail discussion doesn't need to be had because we have two distinct corridors that can be prioritized.
Thank you. Nate, I'm going to give you control of the meeting for just bringing folks back, and then we're going to go directly to public comment.
Okay, this will be quick. Just, we have a kind of schedule to the end of the year right in front of us. The draft report, we will have it on the web and to the council by the end of this month, by the 28th. We're reviewing the internal drafts now, so we will have that to you folks by that date. As part of this process, statutory, it requires a public meeting. So we've gone ahead and sort of scheduled and got the Greeley Center for Monday, December 5th. So in-person public meeting, and again, that will be just DOT, VHB presenting the RUAC process. So it's just for you folks to be there and listen and take all the comment in. 6 to 8.
Yes, 6 PM to 8 PM.
Yep. So we're working on putting out notice right now. We're working on it today. So we'll put out notice to try to get that going.
It will be streamed, we're working on that. so
Right.
It's
It's
not
streamed
going to
just
be,
like this.
it's not going to be a Zoom meeting, it'll be just streamed.
Right. So you could just be helpful if you were there. You don't have to participate, but just be there and take it all in. Lastly, so we have a reoccurring meeting. The next one is December 22nd. I don't know, close to Christmas, do people want to keep that meeting?
My family doesn't like me, so I'll be here. If anybody wants to join me, let me know.
These meetings are hard to reschedule, but, you know, we can try if you'd like to. It's up to. Okay.
So we'll try. Let Nate know if you cannot be here on the 22nd. We're going to consider it a tentative go unless Nate gets a majority that says no.
Is there a reason that we are going to need a meeting after that, or should we just try to finish up?
Well, I think that's the start of us finishing up. I've kind of read the other corridor report. It's very short, the recommendation, so the lift didn't look that big, but with this group, we might have 3 different recommendations, so
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So
We-
I'm not expecting anything till after the public hearing.
Okay, okay. I think we should have a January meeting on our calendars.
Should
but-
put one.
Yeah, if we don't,
All right.
that's it.
All right, thank you, Nate. Now I'll open it up to the public. You will be able to see the timer right in front of you on the monitor, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the podium, so folks at home could see you and hear you. And please state your name and, the town of residency you represent. And this person was the very first person here, so I'm glad you're up there. So, yes, please talk into the mic, too, because it is hard if you stand away. Yep.
Patty Barber. I live in Hiram, near Freiburg. Hiram is actually a stop on the Mountain Division rail line. At one point, I had great hopes that I would be able to take a train from my small town into Portland. As a matter of fact, I could have taken a train from Hiram right to this very meeting on tracks that are today in contention. But instead, I forever have to drive, and I hate to drive. You see, the first Rail Trail Council, the Mountain Division one, voted to tear up the tracks and put in a walking path after aggressive lobbying by the trail people. Well, they forever eliminated my right to transportation options, which for me does not include long-distance running or long-distance biking. And from my observation, the members of the Mountain Division Council were unsure about what they were being asked to do, much like many of you people here. They felt they needed to make a difficult choice, either trail or rail, and many struggled with that choice. They were never informed that no decision was a valid decision. Do you on this council have that choice? As discussed in the August 25th Rail Use Advisory Council meeting, when Bill Shane asked about having to reach a consensus, Nate Howard answers, this is not a consensus-driven process. When Nate Moulton clarified, I want to fall back on Nate's comment, we don't need to get to consensus for this recommendation. Let's get to an endpoint in 9 months if we can, and if we can't, we don't. I also feel the public comments to the Mountain Division Council were misrepresented. Maine DOT's Advisory Council summary and recommendations for the Mountain Division dated May 2022, they state, a public hearing was held on March 31st, 2022, in which over 150 individuals submitted written public comment for consideration. Generally, the trail use option had the most support from those who submitted comments. However, a majority of the commenters who supported trail did not distinguish whether they supported trail until rail, option 2, or rail with trail, option 3.
Patty,
It's
do you
okay.
want to submit your written comments as part of the public record today, or we'll let you
Ken,
go again
you let me
after
finish?
everybody else has
Okay.
gone first,
I'll-
okay?
I'll take
Thank
up
you.
the rest of it.
Next. Up right up there, sir. Masked man.
Ed Soslovic, resident of Portland. I wore my mask today that has passenger train cars on it to show that I am truly modally agnostic, as I said I was last time. 2 quick points. You all have been at it hard. Number one, I spent several hours going through the comments that have been submitted to you all. Overwhelming public support up and down the entire line and beyond for a trail until possible rail use. And as I said before, I think it's highly unlikely that if you build a trail and it'll be so heavily utilized that people will want it to go back to a train. So there's that. Secondly, we keep talking about climate change. We need to get people out of their cars. But in Maine, with the population density that we have, do you really think that heavy rail or even light rail is feasible beyond the corridor, basically between Portland and Boston? The Metro Breeze, I'm on the Metro board, I'm not speaking for them, but the Metro Breeze carries far more riders between Brunswick, Yarmouth, Freeport, and Portland than the Downeaster does among those stops, because it goes where the people are and it goes where people want to go. I think we need to, when we looked at Forest Avenue rezoning in Portland, and Jeremiah should know this, the consultant said you barely have the population density there to support high-frequency bus transit. If we don't have the population density in Forest Avenue to support high-frequency bus transit, do we really have it between here and Lewiston Auburn? So I would ask you not to be seduced by the romance of the rail and recognize that if we really want to get people out of their cars, we need to improve our bus network, which we're doing. Metro carries far more riders on an annual basis than the Downeaster does. And if we have $200 million to put into rail and we want to make that the best use of our taxpayer dollars, maybe we got to improve service between Portland and Boston. Get more people out of their cars there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My name is Richard Rudolph, and I was selected to be on the next Rail to Trail committee that will be taking place dealing with the lower road. The first point I would make, when we think about our former legislators, they were pretty smart buying rail lines that could be possibly saved and used at a later date. What I heard here today, at least, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was the first one to speak who talked about population. I just took a train from Greenfield and Northampton, Massachusetts, down to New Haven, Connecticut to do some research at Yale. Guess what? Northampton has a population of about 32,000. Greenfield, Massachusetts, the other major stop, has a population of 18 to 19,000 people. So there's that issue. What I heard here today is people are saying, well, there never could be a train because we don't have the population. The other issue that was raised has to do with equity. The people in this room, including myself, are probably pretty well off. But there's people in Lewiston and Auburn who could really benefit from having a train going to their downtown communities to Portland, Maine. And I'm not talking about the main line. The main line is what, a mile and a half out of downtown center? And as I think a lot of you know, there's a whole issue in Portland about workers. Where are we going to get the workers from? Well, there's lots of people in Lewiston and Auburn who would probably be willing to take a train to go to work in Portland, Maine. And of course, the other issue is about bus service. If you think about where the buses go, Concord Trailways, they don't go to downtown locations. They're a mile to 2 miles out, whether it's Brunswick, whether it's Augusta, or Bangor.
Thank you, Richard. You'll have an opportunity to speak again if we get through everybody here in the room.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Carl Wilcox, 1047 Intervale Road. I couldn't agree more with Mr. Jeremy Bartlett's statements, because I think there's a gross inequity and inconsideration of people with less economic means. I basically see this project of a trail as being self-serving for the wealthy. And you can certainly do a path from Yarmouth or Freeport down to Portland. The issue is I'm probably relatively unique. I actually live in the house I was born in 60 years ago, and I've seen what's happened in New Gloucester. The houses in the area of where there'd be a train station, which would make sense to me, at Penny Road and Intervale, have increased 521% the last 53 years. And the Penny Road, it's gone from 18 houses to 234, 1,200% increase. And a number of those houses have an assessed value of less than $40,000 because they're old mobile homes. And those people commute into Portland to work. Basically changing grandma's diapers, which is true. I've sat at the polls a few years ago, and they're just working people. They come in dusty, carpenters, and they're doing the work to keep Portland going. And a train can get them into Portland. And as I think this gentleman said, the former mayor of Portland, correct? When you were a former mayor at one point in time? It's about the last mile. I actually drove for the Metro for a short period of time. There's hardly anybody takes a bus from the train station downtown. There's a lot of people will take the Metro from Brunswick to downtown. If you take this train, that's the CSX line.
Thank you, Carl. We'll have the chance to get back to you. Anyone else wants to speak for the first time? Patty, if you would like to finish.
Hope I can do this in 2 more minutes. So I was talking about trail on trail rail versus trail with rail for people who support trails. This is a huge distinction. It's the
Can you
difference-
come closer to the microphone? Thank you.
It's the difference between pulling up the tracks or leaving train options. Yet Maine DOT leads parties to assume all trail options mean trail until rail or interim trail. And let me discuss a bit about this interim nature or trail until rail. Whoever coined these terms were very clever. It gives cover for those who might feel guilty about tearing up the tracks. And we all know the process of removing a trail to replace train tracks is much more complicated than the trail people have you believe. If they want to use the statement trail into rail, then the cost estimate of this interim trail needs to include the cost of returning the tracks into use. If this figure is not included, then it's just trail. Tear up the tracks for a trail, full stop. And I'd like to make one more point. I feel that these rail use advisory council meetings are an inappropriate venue for the detailed and in-depth analysis that you've been tasked with, that the legislative mandate that you are following is fundamentally flawed. To ask the council members to make such complicated decisions, one that will have far-reaching and long-term impacts on the entire state of Maine's transportation policy, is just wrong. If you have been asked to reach such a decision that represents the majority of taxpayers in your jurisdiction in just 9 meetings, well, that's quite the ask. But here you are, and you need to come to a conclusion. Well, I have a few asks of you. That when you read or listen to public comments, you might support a trail, don't automatically assume they wish to tear up the tracks. It stands to reason that many of those people would prefer a trail beside rail. That you consider all of your taxpayers' needs, including those who may not have the courage or ability to speak up, and that no decision can be a decision. Thank you for the opportunity to
Great
speak.
job. Ed or Richard?
Well, the other point that should be made here has to do with population, certain people like myself who may not want to drive or can't drive. And we can talk about young people who don't afford or can't afford a car. And those are 2 population groups that would definitely benefit from having a passenger rail line that was operational in that corridor, the old St. Lawrence Atlantic rail corridor. And think about it also in terms of, someone mentioned climate change. Well, good luck. With electric cars costing $50,000, $60,000, $100,000, how many people in the short run are going to really be able to buy an electric car? And I know DOT loves it because it will give them more opportunities to widen the roads and to install charging stations. But we need to get beyond that kind of mindset. We need to keep in mind who those people are and what they're all about. They're motivated to pour more concrete, more cement, more tar, and they are clueless about the benefits of passenger rail. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mr. Former Mayor.
As we say, you can't swing a stick in Portland without hitting a former mayor, though. And some people want to hit, no. Just 2 really quick points. I was glad you brought up the Belfast Rail Trail, because I mentioned that in my comments at the last meeting as a shining example of what this could become. And second, I just wanted to reinforce the point. It's not just about recreational trail. The trail, especially between Portland and Yarmouth, would be a commuting route. People would be biking and walking to work, and it ties up very nicely with, and could even more once Cumberland joins the Metro, but it already intersects with the Breeze service. And so people could bike one way, take the bus the other way. So I don't want people to get the impression that those of us who favor a trail are just some sort of elite whatevers. This is part of the active, and I would hope that GP-COG and PAX could point that out too in terms of the planning for that. This trails are part of our transportation network. They're not just for recreation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And last call, Carl.
Finish up on the connection. So I drove for the Metro for a short period of time, and there was virtually no people went from the train station, the transportation center, to downtown. There were a lot of people that actually did take the breeze. The point is, this CSX option goes out in what, Western Portland? What's in Western Portland for somebody to commute? Unless there's a lot of investment in the Metro, but I see the chair of the Metro person left, to get from the transportation center over to St. John to downtown, you have missed the last mile. It's like running fiber optic. If you haven't built the last mile, it's worthless. And the Grand Trunk line could easily extend it. It used to historically go right down Commercial Street to tie in. All you got to do is make it to Franklin Street and use the median. After all, that median was put in there to drive poor people out of town. I'm just old enough to remember them being torn down. That was urban renewal. Same thing up in Arbor. Great Falls, tear down the neighborhood to get the old people, the poor people out. So you can run this train right down the median, and historically, the tracks came up from the Deering Park through the Somerset Street and ended just shy of the Franklin Arterial. You could connect all the way through downtown to the new train station, which I agree should be over there by Mercy Hospital. That is vision. Running this line down to CSX, you're going to limit your use forever. And Michelle Wu, the new mayor of Boston, can say it more eloquently than I, as she was on the Freakonomics radio a couple months ago, dealing with, this is a quote from her, "We know that the foundation for equitable access to opportunities is connectedness, the ability to get around. A 2015 longitudinal study of several hundred people that Harvard conducted showed that the factor most closely linked to a family's ability to rise out of poverty, in fact, wasn't the scores of schools in the area, it wasn't the public safety statistics. In fact, it was the average commute time to work, or I would like to throw in the ability to commute to work. So there's a relationship between transportation and particularly transportation infrastructure decisions in which communities have access to economic opportunity."
You're out of time, Carl. Thank you. And I would encourage folks, if you do have lots of comments, we can put them into the public record. If you want to submit them to Nate Howard, he'd be happy to include those. And the 2 minutes was basically decided by the group. I'm wondering if we should extend that to 3 minutes on December 5th, so we don't have to go through a circular group. Anybody have a feeling one way or the other? Because we'll have a counter clock on that day. It's just a lot easier. Yeah.
I agree with 3 minutes.
Dick, you got outvoted, sorry. Those who had opinion. I do appreciate everybody kind of following the 2-minute guideline today. I really do. It makes a lot. Now, Tony, I really would hope we could get your stuff.
You're going to get
okay.
it.
No, not in that way, Tony. Not in that way. I don't mind reading it. I really don't mind reading it. I think it's important for us to make an informed decision.
I'm just not ready. I was going to ask, what's the deadline for this? Making sure we get into this report, because I'm going to say again and again, it's a seriously flawed report coming out of.
And Nate,
our
what is the deadline for public comment to be submitted to you to be part of the report?
Well, so the draft comes out of the 28th, but still, we can take public comment on the draft, so towards, usually 30 days, so by the end of the year, is fine.
How do we get in the draft?
You can submit comments to me, once the draft is out. if
So
you'd
the
like.
draft will have all the comments in it, all 3,000?
It will not. You know, you can submit comments if you'd like on the
Well,
draft.
I'd like to have mine as the only rail advocate chosen by the legislature to attend this council. I would hope that my comments are going to be included in the final draft, rather than.
We'll take a look at your comments. That's all I can say right now.
You'll make that choice?
Okay.
Not say that, Tony.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here today, and hopefully you can make it here on December 5th. Thanks again.
Just like, yeah, I'm gonna send Jason.